Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in tonight. On behalf of Miami Book Fair and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Martin J. Sherwin to discuss Gambling with Armageddon, Nuclear Roulette from Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis, published by our friends at Knopf. In this groundbreaking look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, Martin Sherwin not only gives us a riveting, sometimes hour-by-hour explanation of the crisis itself, but also explores the origins, scope, and consequences of the evolving place of nuclear weapons in the post-World War II world. Martin J. Sherwin is the author of A World Destroyed, Hiroshima and Its Legacies, which won the Stuart L. Bernath Prize, as well as the American History Book Prize, and the co-author with Kai Bird of American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 2006. Martin Sherwin has spent his career in the study of nuclear weapons and how they have shaped our world. Gambling with Armageddon is an outstanding capstone to his work thus far. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by Kai Bird. Kai is a Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer and journalist. He's the executive director and distinguished lecturer of the Leon Levy Center for Biography at the Cooney Graduate Center in New York City. He is the author of the forthcoming presidential biography, The Outlier, The Righteous Presidency of Jimmy Carter. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to those right after the talk. You can find Gambling with Armageddon or any other book you might need for purchase at Books and Books below by pressing the green button. You can also use the donate button to support us, and any amount is welcome. Indie bookstores need your help now more than ever, so we thank you. But now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the stage.
Hello.
Hello.
Good evening. My name is Kai Bird, and I'm really delighted to be here this evening for the Miami Book Fair. I'm a great fan of the fair and of Books and Books, and I'm even a resident of Miami Beach part of the year. And I'm also delighted to be here this evening with my old friend Marty Sherwin to celebrate his very new book about the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's, as Christina was saying, is called Gambling with Armageddon, Nuclear Roulette from Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Marty and I are very old friends and collaborators. We wrote a book together on Robert Oppenheimer that happened to win a Pulitzer, and it was a lot of fun working with Marty. And many years ago, when he finally settled on a new book, The Missile Crisis, I was skeptical that there was anything, new to say about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I had written about the crisis in small chapters in both of my biographies of John McCloy and McGeorge Bundy, and I thought we knew everything that there was to know. But I had forgotten the Sherwin method, which is to fill up your closets with more and more documents until they're so stuffed you can't open the door. And that's what Marty did with this book. And he has proven me terribly wrong. This book has become already the definitive account of the missile crisis, a riveting thriller account. It reads like a mystery novel, even though we know what happened, that we survived. So Marty, I guess I want to begin where you begin the book, with you as a very young air intelligence officer, delivering top secret war plans to your commanding officer. So you were right there. So this very personal connection, I guess, to the missile crisis. Was this your motivation for digging into what happened?
Thank you for all that, Kai. I think my motivation was more connected to the history that I've studied and I've taught for almost 50 years now. 50 years. Not kidding. But, that connection did create a special relationship to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was not in the middle of it by any means. I was on the West Coast, as I explain in the book. But nevertheless, there was a sense of excitement and engagement. And I remember how often my students would say, "You were in the Navy? You were in the Cuban Missile Crisis?"
This ancient history.
Why? How? And that sort of thing. So, there was a little extra excitement.
So you discovered a lot of new things. Give us 2 or 3 examples of the most surprising revelations that you have from this book, or anecdotes that got your juices going.
Okay. The interesting thing about the way the book evolved is that it didn't start off the way it ended up. My initial idea was to do a book about the military and the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I discovered 2 things. One, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had destroyed all their minutes. They had verbatim minutes from 1948 all the way to 1975, and they destroyed them in 1975. So that
outrageous.
It was outrageous. And fortunately, a historian on the Joint Chiefs of Staff managed to take notes on those minutes. So we do have some very good information, but not the kind of information that would compose a whole book on the issue. So I decided to ask the question, how did the Cuban Missile Crisis begin? Not Khrushchev suddenly getting this idea about putting missiles in Cuba, but where did he get the idea? And why was it missiles as opposed to 50,000 Soviet troops or tactical nuclear weapons? Why ballistic medium range and intermediate range ballistic missiles? That's the real underlying question. And the more I explored it, the more I realized you had to go back to Hiroshima to figure out how nuclear weapons became the foundation, really, of Cold War policies between the United States and the Soviet Union. And while I don't believe in inevitability, the probability of something like that happening was very, very high, simply because it was, in a sense, obvious. The United States had sent Jupiter missiles, same kinds of missiles, 130 miles from the Soviet Union to Turkey. Why shouldn't Khrushchev think that this would work? So that's not really the kind of discovery, but it's an important point to get across, and so that's number one. Number two. Adley Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, who after the Cuban Missile Crisis was pilloried by the Kennedy administration as Adley wanted a Munich. Well, when you look closely at the evidence, which I did, you discover that Adley Stevenson actually was the architect of the peaceful resolution of the crisis. And what I have to say about Stevenson was extremely important. The third thing I would say is Kennedy's, following John Kennedy's thinking about the crisis. From the first days of the crisis, where he agreed with all of his advisors that the missiles had to be bombed and Cuba probably invaded, to being if you pardon my use of the term, the outlier
I like that word.
The outlier at the end of the crisis, the only one who was determined to do virtually anything to avoid a nuclear war. And we're able to know that because of these secret tape recordings that were recorded during cabinet room and Oval Office meetings.
Right. Well, those are all very important points, but it seems to me that you begin early on in the book. You tell this riveting story about this Russian submarine and a Captain Vasily Arkhipov. And I think that's just such a fabulous story. I mean, we're told repeatedly that I grew up being taught that the Cuban Missile Crisis was a dangerous episode, but well managed by the president and his advisors. But here you tell this story that is quite frightening. Give us a flavor of what happened on that submarine.
Well, the bottom line is that, and McGeorge Bundy once said this to me, crisis managers can't manage everything. And he understood that no matter how carefully the president, the secretary of defense, the national security advisor, secretary of state were trying to manage things. And it's really interesting to watch how Kennedy tried to manage the behavior of American ships on the blockade line. No matter how carefully they do it, down below the highest decision makers, there are people who are facing dangerous situations and they make decisions, and it's very easy to make the wrong decision. And the story of the Soviet submarines is connected exactly to that. There were 4 Soviet submarines on the blockade line. There were conventional submarines, so they had to recharge their batteries. Each of those submarines had a nuclear warhead torpedo on board, which the United States had no idea that that was the case. And the anti-submarine warfare efforts to surface those submarines included doing some things that the skippers of these destroyers were told not to do. They were throwing grenades overboard to force the submarine to the surface. And,
live grenades.
Grenades, and boom, and the captain of one of the submarines, B-59, his name was Savitsky, panicked. He was sure that they were trying to sink him. And he famously says, we load up, this torpedo. We are going to sink them all. We will not be the shame of the fleet. And they're actually less than a minute away from firing this torpedo at a U.S. aircraft carrier when a second Soviet officer, Vasily Arkhipov, who was a cooler head, realizes that they're not trying to sink the submarine. They're just trying to bring it to the surface. And he manages to countermand the order. But it's a matter of, sort of 1 minute. And we're just lucky that Arkhipov was aboard that submarine. And one of the themes of the book is how large a role luck plays in these kinds of situations. So
right, yeah. So if the captain of the Russian submarine had fired that nuclear-tipped torpedo, that would have precipitated war, wouldn't it? General war, or
nuclear war, because
nuclear.
President would have felt compelled to respond with nuclear weapons in some fashion against the Soviet Union. Sinking an aircraft carrier kills 4,500 Americans.
Yeah.
Given that it was a nuclear torpedo, it probably would have sunk some of the ships that were near the aircraft carrier. Kennedy would have felt that he had no choice. So,
and they had no idea that the Russian submarines were armed with atomic weapons.
no, that's a sort of a general point to make. The Americans had no idea of several things. They had no idea that Soviet subs had nuclear torpedoes on them. The CIA had reported that the Soviets had shipped inserted 10,000 Soviet troops onto Cuba, when actually they had inserted 42,000. We had no idea that they had all those 42,000 troops had tactical nuclear weapons. If the president had listened to his advisors, both the military and the civilian advisors, and invaded Cuba with 90,000 troops, a lot of them would have been blown off the beaches by tactical nuclear weapons. And the rest of them would have met 42,000 Soviet troops rather than the 10,000 that were expected. So, we were really poorly informed, and that's one of the greatest dangers of any of these confrontations. It's not possible to know all the information that's relevant in terms of a confrontation between two nations.
Right. Yeah, particularly two nations armed with nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
So your book really, your book begins not with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but really it's a history of the whole Cold War, beginning with the end of World War II and the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. And you give us a real sense of the sort of thinking of the military minds about how to use these weapons. Let's talk for a moment about one General Curtis LeMay. How did he view the bomb, and how did the bomb fit into his war plans?
Well, Curtis LeMay is one of the foundational figures in the history of those 17 years between 1945 and 1962. It was during those 17 years that the whole framework for understanding how nuclear weapons were used in the Cold War is set. LeMay was famously or infamously the commander of the squadrons during World War II that bombed Tokyo and burned it down. He took over the Strategic Air Command in 1948. He built it up into not only a very effective fighting force, but the most powerful military lobby in the United States. And he was supported by General and then President Eisenhower. Now, I said General Eisenhower because what I think it's important to understand is that the military officers who were involved as the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Cuban Missile Crisis all were products of World War II. And it was the framework of the end of World War II, the strategic bombing, that focused their attention on nuclear weapons. Even though there were lots of admirals and generals during World War II, including Eisenhower, who were against bombing Hiroshima, felt it was totally unnecessary. Eisenhower said that in Crusade in Europe, and he repeated it in 1960 after his presidency. Nevertheless, he was the leader, really, of the idea that nuclear weapons were the cheapest and safest way to guarantee American security during his presidency. When he was inaugurated on January 20th, 1953, there were about 1,300, something like that, nuclear weapons in the American arsenal. 7 years later, 8 years later, when he left office, there were over 22,000 nuclear weapons. Eisenhower set the framework for relying on nuclear weapons, and Khrushchev merely copied that framework. So, it's very important to understand, this long history of the Cuban Missile Crisis in order to understand the role that nuclear weapons played in the Cold War.
And unlike what Eisenhower told the American people in the 1950s, these weapons were not cheap. I think you say that they cost between $5 and $6 trillion to manufacture and maintain them. So it was a very expensive, quote, defense.
So building a nuclear weapon is one thing, but the real expensive parts of it are the delivery systems. And as the delivery systems got more and more sophisticated and complicated, the so-called more bang for the buck idea that nuclear weapons promised in 1953 just went out the window.
And by 1962, when the missile crisis comes along and Kennedy is suddenly faced with this dilemma, you write about how the generals immediately wanted to launch airstrikes against the missile sites and prepare for nearly simultaneously, an invasion. And yet, in the early meetings of the XCOM, the advisors meeting to discuss how to deal with this crisis, you quote McNamara as saying, and this comes from the taping system that Kennedy had installed, you have Defense Secretary McNamara saying, well, it's not really a military problem. These missiles in Cuba don't really change the balance of power. What it is a domestic political problem. He uses that phrase directly.
Yes.
And so that's the issue, isn't it?
Yes, it is. President Kennedy agreed with McNamara. He said, what's the difference between whether you get killed by a missile from Cuba or a missile from Moscow? And then later on in the week, he talks about, Soviet submarines could do, the same. They had
the same thing, right?
The same thing. It was a political problem. It was an international problem in the sense of alliance diplomacy, but it was really Kennedy's reelection that was at stake.
Right.
After the Bay of Pigs disaster, as Kennedy told John Kenneth Galbraith later on, that there was, no chance his administration could suffer anything like this again. So the Cuban Missile Crisis was the Bay of Pigs on steroids politically. And so, politics, domestic politics was, right there, as it always
is, huh? All right, let's talk about the Bay of Pigs, though. I mean, it's very clear from your narrative that that's really what the Bay of Pigs is, what planted the notion in Khrushchev's mind that he's got to do something to defend Cuba, Castro's Cuba. And so the the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs is both the catalyst is a failure, perfect failure, you write, but it also teaches Kennedy to be very suspicious of his generals. So it also plants the seeds for resolving peacefully the missile crisis. This is highly ironic, I think, no?
Yes, no, I think it is. Well, there's a lot of ironies. The first irony is that when Eisenhower orders the Jupiter missiles, the intercontinental missiles put into Turkey, which trigger this idea in Khrushchev's head, well, I can do the same thing. They become, at the end of the crisis, one of the bargaining chips to allow Khrushchev and Kennedy to trade missiles in Cuba for missiles in Turkey. So that's one irony. The other irony is the Bay of Pigs. If it had not happened, there never would have been a Cuban Missile Crisis. It's just a certainty in Khrushchev's mind and Castro's mind that Kennedy will not be able to tolerate living with this failure, this perfect failure, and he will figure out some excuse to send American troops into Cuba. So Khrushchev thinks, what do I do? And his decision was to copycat the Eisenhower/Kennedy decision to put the missiles in Turkey. Right.
So Eisenhower doesn't come off very well in your narrative. He seems to have created some of the circumstances for, he planned the Bay of Pigs fiasco and sort of forced it on Kennedy. He created, therefore, the circumstances 18 months later for the Cuban Missile Crisis. He gave us this enormous nuclear arsenal at great cost. So are you a revisionist on the Eisenhower presidency at this point?
Well, it depends. I mean, Eisenhower didn't have a very good reputation back in the 1960s. And then there was a revisionism. But, there are several things to say. Eisenhower legitimately has to be what I want to say is that Eisenhower has to accept the responsibility for the Bay of Pigs, for the buildup of the nuclear arms race, and so on. There are other aspects of Eisenhower that, I don't go into. This is not a biography or a study of his entire presidency. It's a study of his relationship to nuclear weapons and how he thought they would add to the economic and military security of the United States. It was a very, very bad decision, a disaster as far as I'm concerned. And in that sense, I am happily a revisionist against those people who argue that, wow, nuclear weapons were just the right thing to prevent World War III. Listen, I'll tell you what prevented World War III during the Cold War. It was World War II. No one in the Soviet Union or in Europe wanted to have another war like that. That would be far worse than the war that they had just experienced.
Well, that brings us back to our generals again. And again, you show repeatedly in the ex-con meetings, they were just the Joint Chiefs. There's this meeting you have portrayed with Kennedy meeting with the Joint Chiefs, and it's a disaster. Curtis LeMay sort of insults him by, at one point, saying, to the president, "You're in a pretty bad fix." And Kennedy sort of looks at him and says, "What did you say?"
says, what did you say? And he says, LeMay repeats it, "You're in a pretty bad fix." He says, "You're in it with me too." And then he adds, "personally," just to make sure LeMay understands what's going on.
So the generals wanted to launch airstrikes and invade. And if Kennedy, I mean, he came pretty close to accepting that at one point, and there was a lot of pressure for him to do it. And if there had been another accident, the submarine firing a torpedo, or there was the U-2 that was shot down that created more pressure to do it, what would have happened if they had launched airstrikes and invaded?
Well, first of all, airstrikes would have killed probably thousands of Soviet soldiers who were guarding the missile sites, which that's what they were going to bomb. And that was the first thing that made Kennedy begin to rethink the idea that airstrikes were a good idea. Although, remember, as I said, Adley Stevenson was the one who first pointed out to him that a military response was a very bad idea. So that's number one. Number two, when the American troops attacked Cuba, they would have been blown off the beaches by tactical nuclear weapons. It
would have been Armageddon.
Well, it certainly would have been on the road to Armageddon. There's no question about it. I mean, Kennedy would have, responded with some nuclear attack somewhere. I'm sure he would have started with a limited one. But Khrushchev then would have felt pressure to respond in some way.
Right.
It was kind of like what Dean Acheson said. Dean Acheson was brought in at one point to what are called the ExComm meetings, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. These were Kennedy's advisors that he handpicked to advise him on what to do here. And Acheson was absolutely adamant. You cannot negotiate with the Soviets. Got to attack. And somebody said, "Well, if we attack, what's going to happen?" He said, "Well, what's going to happen is, the Soviets are going to, respond. And what do we do then?" And he said, "Well, we have to respond to their response. And what happens then?" He said, "Well, at that point, you hope that cooler heads prevail." By that point, there are no cool heads left.
There are no more cooler heads. Yeah. So let's get back to Adley Stevenson, who turns out to be really, in some ways, the hero of this story, because at the very beginning he gives JFK sound advice, i.e., you can't respond militarily, and this can be solved with diplomacy. And JFK sort of rejects his advice in the beginning, but knows that he's being told something sound. And yet, in the end, he does exactly, after much anguish, he does exactly what Stevenson suggested. He solves it with diplomacy. You referred to the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. He trades them, but he trades them secretly. We don't know about it for decades. And I'm astonished. At one point, you write that right after the crisis was settled, Kennedy gets on the phone with Harry Truman and the other ex-presidents and tells them how he had masterfully solved this crisis. And he lied to Truman. You say he lied to Truman about how, denying that he had made any secret deal about Turkey. It's an incredible admission.
Well, he not only lies to Truman, but he lies to Hoover and he lies to Eisenhower. And the same thing. Worse than that, I say at one point, his best instincts were at the very forefront of the decision making at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and after the Cuban Missile Crisis, his absolute worst political instincts took charge, and there was an article drafted for the Saturday Evening Post by his good friend Bartlett, who would introduce him to Jackie. And Bartlett and Alsop were writing this article, and they showed him on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they showed Kennedy a draft. And in the margin of the draft, he noted Adley wanted a Munich. And this ended up destroying Adley Stevenson, which is exactly what Kennedy wanted to do. What is so, talk about ironies, it was the president who was willing to have a Munich rather than nuclear war. Thank God, which was, made an awful lot of sense. And for that, he should receive, a great deal of appreciation from all of us who are now here talking when we wouldn't be if he didn't think that way.
Right. No, it's a terrible sort of personal political story where he puts his own political instincts above treating this ambassador and former Democratic presidential nominee with any decency. Terrible reflection. So what again, when I was in college and beginning to read about Cold War history, I was taught that the narrative was that cooler heads prevailed, and a whole school of historical thought came up about crisis management, and the lesson was that we were in good hands, that our political leaders had good judgment. And so I wonder, how would you briefly summarize how this book changes that narrative?
Well, in several ways. First of all, the element of luck is absolutely essential. And it would take a couple of hours to talk about all the aspects of that. But it's there throughout the history of the crisis. That's one thing. Another thing, as I said earlier, even McGeorge Bundy understood that crisis managers can't manage everything. And in the nuclear age, and McNamara later on said this many, many times, that it was luck. Dean Acheson wrote in a review of Robert Kennedy's book that it was plain dumb luck. That's his phrase. Plain dumb luck that we got out of the crisis without a nuclear war. Well, that's really scary, especially from the guy who was urging that we invade Cuba. I quote George Kennan at one point in the book where he says, nuclear weapons can in no way create a hopeful foreign policy. They are at best a deterrent against themselves. And one of the foundational lessons of this study is that nuclear weapons themselves are responsible for these nuclear crises, and they're no good whatsoever in solving those crises. The idea, well, we haven't had a war with a major world war since 1945, and it's because of nuclear weapons. It's not because of nuclear weapons. The fact that we came so close to having a disastrous situation was because of nuclear weapons. What nuclear weapons did was undermine the diplomatic process. The whole relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union in a world without nuclear weapons would have been a much more realistic set of compromises on both sides. Now there are those people who don't want to compromise at all. But look, American democracy and stability in international relations is built on compromise. And as soon as you refuse to compromise at all, you are heading down the road to Armageddon. I mean, that's the gamble.
So we're getting close to where we should open it up for questions, but I have a couple more thoughts. Coming back to that Joint Chiefs meeting with JFK, General Wheeler at one point asked JFK if he was contemplating, quote, whether anything at all should be done. From the tone of Kennedy's comments, the general sort of picked up, oh, he's thinking maybe this isn't a military threat that needs a military response, and maybe he should do nothing. And so he's asking Kennedy point blank, and Kennedy replies, that's right. So why didn't Kennedy just do nothing? And I suppose the answer is the domestic political pressures he was facing. But also, isn't it, this is a counterfactual, but don't you think if he had done nothing or found a way diplomatically to ignore, Stevenson was telling him that, the Soviet adventure in Cuba is going to end in a disaster. Maybe in a way, the Cuban Missile Crisis solidified Castro's hold over the island and prolonged communist rule over Cuba in a way that most people don't realize.
Well, there's no question about it. I mean, one of the ways the crisis was solved were two compromises on Kennedy's part. One was a public statement that the United States would not invade Cuba, which was Khrushchev's primary goal in putting the missiles in Cuba. So
Khrushchev won.
So check one off for Khrushchev. The secret agreement was that the United States, within a few months, would remove those missiles in Turkey that bothered that bothered Khrushchev so much. Check off two for Khrushchev. He got 2 out of 3 of what he wanted. 3 was establishing a very strong military presence 90 miles from the United States. That one he lost on, but he got 2 out of 3. So, he did pretty well, as he explained to his Politburo colleagues. But he was the first to cross the line of rationality and agreed to pull his missiles out. And so he seemed to be the loser.
Right.
But anyway, General Wheeler, your point about that. One of the interesting things about having these secret tapes is that you have the exact words and the exact rhythm of the exchanges that are occurring that you cannot get out of someone just taking notes on a meeting.
Right.
And by that point in the meeting that you quote, it's the very end. And you can just hear Kennedy is kind of exhausted from arguing with these guys. And and I say that it's like it's like a father at the end of an argument with his teenage son. Yes, that's the way it is, General. Yes, that's what I'm thinking about it. And then the general says, but if we are going to do something, you're with us. And he says, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
whatever you say.
Exhausted.
So.
So, Marty, you end your book in a very dramatic way, to my mind. You devote a whole page to just one quote. And I'm going to read part of the quote, but I won't say who said this. And we'll let our viewers guess. And at the end of the Q&A, we'll see if any of them can come up with the name. And if not, we will reveal the name.
Okay.
So here's the quote. And by the way, here's the book. So, Gambling with Armageddon. Naturally, the common people don't want war. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along. Whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship, or a parliament or a communist dictatorship, voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them that they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country. So I'll leave for the moment it a mystery who said that, but here's the book, and we'll now turn to a few more questions.
And it's that quote, Kai, the reason that I'm going to donate $5 for every book sold to the Biden campaign.
Okay. Okay, let's see. We've got a few questions here. What kind of pressure came from the Cubans to use Soviet nuclear weapons against the US? How did this affect Cuban-Soviet relations? This is from Gene Rosenberg.
Well, there's a famous letter that, famous among those people who study this in detail, letter that Castro wrote on Saturday night, the night before the crisis ended, wrote to Khrushchev saying, if the United States invades Cuba, the Soviets should launch their intercontinental ballistic missiles against the United States. And when Khrushchev received this letter, he was dumbfounded. He said, Castro doesn't understand anything. We didn't do this to start a nuclear war. We did this to frighten the United States from invading Cuba. And as I point out, in some way, this letter solidified Khrushchev's thinking about getting out of this crisis quickly. Things are coming apart. You mentioned the U-2 had been shot down without authorization from Moscow. Of course, the United States didn't know we weren't, the Soviets weren't, the Soviets weren't authorized to shoot that U-2 down.
Yeah, it was Castro who gave the order.
No, it wasn't Castro. Castro influenced the Soviets, because he was yelling at them, why are you allowing those U-2s to fly over? What the hell are the surface-to-air missiles for? Blah, 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 blah. But it was the Soviet second in command who made the decision.
Pressured by Castro.
Yeah, I think the atmosphere that Castro was creating certainly contributed to that, yes.
So here's another question. This viewer says, early on, you explained that Kennedy was the only one in the room who was against aggressive action. Can you explain the evolution of his thought process and, besides Stevenson, the variables that explain his final decision.
This explains it. It is the whole second half of the book that's what the issue is. Sort of what made Kennedy move from being the president who was willing to bomb and invade Cuba to the president who was determined to try almost anything, not anything, but almost anything to avoid a nuclear war, anything that he considered sensible. And he certainly considered trading the Jupiter missiles as sensible. All of his advisors on the XCOM were against it. And Kennedy says to them, and this is a quote, "We are not going to have a very good war if people understand that is all we had to do was to trade these outmoded Jupiter missiles in Turkey for the missiles in Cuba." But his advisors are absolutely adamant. No, we can't, respond with a gun on our head and blah, 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 blah. And so he just goes off on his own and decides to try to make this happen.
So apart from Stevenson, was anyone in XCOM helpful in arriving at a settlement, or is XCOM overrated?
Yes, Llewellyn Thompson.
This is from Phil Nash, by the way.
Oh, okay. Who knows the answer to this question better than I do? Phil Nash is the author of The Other Missiles of October, which is one of the really great books about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's about the Jupiter missiles. There's no. Repeat the question. I got so tired.
Apart from Adley Stevenson, was anyone else on XCOM helpful in arriving at a settlement?
Yeah. Llewellyn Thompson was very important to Kennedy. Llewellyn Thompson had been the ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1958 till early before the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was part of the XCOM. He knew Khrushchev well. He was not a yes man. He told it the way it was, and Kennedy relied a lot on him. George Ball was mostly helpful. He was a supporter of Stevenson. And Sorensen was pretty helpful too. Bobby Kennedy was not nearly as helpful as he promotes himself as having been in his book, 13 Days. One of the things that I don't think I'm the only one who's made this point, but people who have studied these tapes very closely all know that Bobby Kennedy, when he was unleashed, when he was not being controlled by his brother, was a real hawk.
Carolyn Eisenberg, the historian up at Hofstra University, asks about Bobby Kennedy and asks what role he played in resisting the Hawks. But he was a hawk himself, but he was instructed by Kennedy to make sure that the Hawks didn't prevail in every meeting, huh?
It is absolutely fascinating to watch this relationship between the two brothers. When Robert Kennedy is out there alone without instructions from Jack, he is saying the craziest things. Like, if this is the way it is, we should have the war now rather than later. It'll be better for our children. Maybe we should sink the Maine again. He's not mature. He's not the Bobby Kennedy of 1968. He's kind of young and dangerous. But when Jack wants something done, he turns to Bobby and he tells him what to do. And Bobby is absolutely devoted to Jack. And when Jack tells him what to do, he does it exactly.
He does it.
Yeah. So, his positive role in the Cuban Missile Crisis is a function of what his brother tells him to do. His hawkish role in the Cuban Missile Crisis is Bobby Kennedy unleashed.
Yeah, no, it's a dramatic story and relationship between the two brothers. So, Marty, I'm going to reserve for myself the last question. I want you to talk a little bit about another small actor who managed to prevent a horrible thing from happening. And this is, I think, a theme of your book, that, this Russian captain, how do I pronounce it? Arkhipov, prevented Armageddon from happening, possibly. And then you also tell the story of an American captain, William Bassett, who did something quite similar. And it's an example, I think, of saner minds prevailing over the pressures of the moment. And this, again, is a very human story, and maybe somewhat hopeful that people, when pushed into a corner, can use their own judgment and stand up to pressures to push the button. So tell us about Captain Bassett. What happened?
Okay. Now, the Bassett story is, you have to be tentative about that, because there's difficulty finding confirmation. But basically, the way, and I say this in the book, so tentatively, basically, we had missiles on Okinawa. The missile crew receives a message that they should fire their missiles. The missiles are aimed at not only the Soviet Union, but some of them at China. And Bassett considers this crazy. What are we firing at China for? And how can we fire missiles if we're in DEFCON 2, Defense Condition 2, rather than Defense Condition 1? And there's a whole kerfuffle going on, and he just puts his foot down and tells the other missile launch officers that he will not permit, Bassett's the senior officer, he will not permit these missiles from being fired. And all of this happening very quickly. And within a few minutes, they come to realize that the order was incorrect. The major who sent this order has to back down, and if true, it is a story that's even scarier than the submarine story.
Yeah, more than one missile.
Well, more than one missile, and Americans, starting something for who knows what reason. Just the crazy order. Was it a mistake? Was it a crazy right-winger who wanted to start, a war? Who knows?
So I've just thought of another last question to ask you. In the news today, in the New York Times, there's a story that reports that the UN system has advanced this treaty to make illegal nuclear weapons, and the 50th nation has ratified, and so that kicks in the activation of the treaty in 3 months. Is this going to go anywhere?
Well, I think it's a symbolic step, and one or two things are going to happen in the long run. We're either going to have a nuclear war, or we're going to get rid of nuclear weapons. That's
not a great choice.
Well, getting rid of nuclear weapons is a good choice. And this is, another step in that direction. Reykjavik, where Reagan and Gorbachev came close to committing their nations to the elimination of nuclear weapons, was, another important moment to keep, in mind. There's nothing written in stone that says that, nuclear weapons have to exist. It is possible to get rid of them. There's a very interesting book about Japan giving up the gun back in the 17th century or something like that, and the samurais deciding that this was a weapon that was just unacceptable. It was immoral. The sword was the way to go. I think we were going to reveal the quote.
That's right. I'm forgetting. Yes, no one has guessed it, so I'll reveal the quote, and then we'll end on that note. That shocking quote comes from German Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring in 1945.
Right.
So.
The
Anyway, on that note, thank you, Marty, for writing a terrific book. Here it is again. Everyone should go to Books and Books and their other independent bookstores and buy the book.
Click on the link below, or you can come by curbside pickup or safe shopping. So we urge you to order today and read more about this fascinating. This was a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. So on behalf of Books and Books, Miami Book Fair, we thank you. We hope to see you in person soon. And good luck with the book. We'll be selling it at all of our stores.
Well, thank you. And let me know how many you sell, because as I said, $5 per book.
I will indeed. Okay. Thank you both very much. And everyone watching, good night. Thank you for joining.